pursuant to the House Order of January 25th, 2021, and therefore members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. The proceedings will be made available via the House of Commons website, so you are aware the webcast will always show the person speaking rather than the entirety of the group. And I think most members are aware of all the technicalities around this. And just to remind people that there is not supposed to be any pictures taken of the meeting, and to keep your mics off when you're not speaking. So we will start with we have three witnesses here today for the session. We'll start with the Professional Institute of Public Services of Canada, with President Ms. Davio, and Quebec's representative, Ms. Couillard. So the floor is yours, Ms. Davio, if you have opening remarks.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon. My name is Debbie Davio. I am president of the Professional Institute of the Public Service of Canada, or PIPS, the national union that represents approximately 1,400 Canada Revenue Agency professionals in Quebec. Overall, we represent some 12,000 auditors at the Canada Revenue Agency across the country. With me today is Mr. Jean Couillard, our representative for our group at CRA, and he's our representative for the Quebec region. He is a CPA and a CGA and a subject matter expert on CRA-related issues. We'd like to thank you for the opportunity to present our views on Bill C-224 and on the possibility of transferring tax processing from the Canada Revenue Agency to Revenue Quebec. Together, we would be happy to answer any and all questions you may have after our presentation. I want to ensure committee members that we have thoroughly researched this issue. Our position is based on substantial academic and expert literature. In a nutshell, C-224 is not in the best interest of Canadians and Quebecers, and there are alternatives to transferring this responsibility to Revenue Quebec. We urge members of Parliament to carefully review our arguments and decide if this is really the road to follow, especially at this time. Why? Because it will have a negative financial impact on taxpayers across Canada, and it will not result in tax processing efficiencies for residents of Quebec. It's a step backwards in the fight against tax evasion. It's a move away from tax fairness. And finally, it will lead to the loss of high-quality jobs in Shawinigan and Jonquière, two smaller provincial communities already hard hit by the pandemic. I'd like to emphasize that we are not the only ones to take this position. Academic and expert literature on this issue demonstrates that there is no clear evidence that decentralization of Canadian tax administration to a provincial authority would result in greater aggregate savings, efficiency, compliance, or accountability as compared to centralizing the administration of provincial taxes at the CRA. Please note that we can provide committee members and any member of Parliament with our list of these studies and references upon request. I'd like to address each of our arguments individually. First, the numbers don't add up. There are no savings or efficiencies to be gained, either for Quebec taxpayers or for those in the rest of Canada. The June 2015 report of the Commission de Révision Permanente des Programmes, which was commissioned by the provincial government itself to look into this and other issues related to government spending and efficiency, found that the most efficient and cost-effective way for Quebecers to have a single tax return would be for the CRA to administer all tax collection. Plus, a shift from the CRA to Revenue Quebec would require a significant expansion of the latter's capacity, as well as an expansion of its administration budget. But the CRA is already in a position to centralize Quebec's tax administration. Second, it represents a step backwards in the fight against tax evasion. We know that other provinces are watching to see what happens with C-224. We believe that if it's adopted, the bill could lead to a balkanization of Canada's tax system, resulting in more regressive taxes and weakened enforcement of measures aimed at combating tax evasion amongst wealthy Canadians and large corporations. Also, because international agreements aimed at fighting tax evasions are signed between central governments, it would be difficult for Quebec to perform the federal government's work in this area without a great many treaties being redrafted. This could lead to increased tax evasion at a time when billions of dollars are sitting offshore that the government is trying to recuperate. This is money that is badly needed to fund the public programs and services that Canadians depend on every day. Third, it's a move away from tax fairness. Progressivity in Canada's tax system largely stems from federal taxes. This is even more the case now as the federal government has introduced more progressive tax measures at both the top and bottom ends of the income spectrum. These measures are delivered through Canada's existing tax system. Their administration would be far more complicated if individual provincial agencies became involved. If we are to have a fairer and more progressive tax system in Canada, it must come from the federal level of government. We can't depend on provincial governments who are by nature and by economic imperatives more constrained in what they can do. Historically, the shift to a tax on income basis for provincial income taxes rather than as a percentage of federal taxes gave them more flexibility to set their own rates. This led to many putting into place considerably less progressive income tax systems. Of course, administration and collection of taxes is different from tax policy making. But further devolution of the administration and collection of taxes will inevitably lead to a greater devolution of tax policy making and to a less progressive tax system overall. Finally, it's critical that we not lose sight of the impacts this could have on employment in Shawinigan and Jonquière, where the Canada Revenue Agency provides good jobs to a great many people. I can't think of a worse time in the middle of a pandemic to start thinking about cutting jobs in smaller communities. The CRA is a governmental leader in the decentralization of its jobs. They are not all concentrated in the National Capital Region, as is often the case with federal jobs, and they may not easily be redeployed to other departments. So to conclude, Bill C-224 should not be adopted. A better way to go, if we want less paperwork, a lighter tax filing burden on individuals, and to ensure that people get the benefits they are entitled to, would be an automatic tax filing. This is something the Trudeau government has committed to implementing, and we support that initiative. And the CRA has the capacity to effectively process Quebec taxes as it already does for the other provinces. I want to thank you for your time. Mr. Couillard and I would be pleased to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Turning then to the public services and para-public services in Quebec, Mr. Sylvester, who is the Vice President, National Executive, Mr. Caron, Research Advisor, and Mr. Goodrow, a political consultant. Welcome. I expect it's you that's up, Mr. Sylvester. Go ahead. Floor is yours.
Oui, absolument. Oui.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much for your invitation. For the past 5 years, our association has proposed that Quebecers fill out only one tax return rather than two, which is currently the case. In order to ensure Quebec's fiscal autonomy, this single tax return should be administered by Quebec Revenue. So we're very enthusiastic about Bill C-224, sponsored by the member for Joliette. We encourage members to take it seriously and support it in the upcoming votes. A single tax return would, of course, bring with it changes, but the benefits would outweigh the drawbacks. It will avoid all job losses with public employers, and there would be all manner of leverages to safeguard these jobs. The advantages of the single tax return are numerous and many. An analysis by the Institut de recherche de l'autodétermination des peuples et de l'indépendance nationale determined that there would be $425 million in saving annually. A denial of this fact smacks of cynicism when it comes to the management of taxpayers' dollars. With all the investments in services to the public, all that money would be better used if this change were to be made. Revenue Quebec wants to be the single taxpayer declaration processor. So there will not be savings, there will be losses. Artificial intelligence is used, for example, to determine which individuals' tax returns do not match up with their assets. Quebec's autonomy must be maintained. It enables the Quebec government to pass its own tax policies and measures in order to avoid penalties. Combating tax evasion and tax avoidance is important to Quebecers, just as demonstrated by the web giants, the desire to tax web giants. There needs to be greater flexibility, and Ottawa needs to cede this authority to Quebec. Revenue Quebec is more present in Quebec than the CRA is. There are over 60% of the points of service are run by Quebec already. We have heard of much testimony regarding Quebecers who have called Revenue Quebec and faced numerous obstacles. So we want to provide solutions in order to mitigate the impact on Quebec workers. As a union, we are very sensitive to these issues. The impact on the 5,000 Quebec jobs that are concerned must be closely studied. And the change should take effect over as many years as necessary. Shawinigan and Saguenay should not pay the price or bear the brunt from this transition to a single tax return. The Saguenay Tax Centre will be more greatly impacted, so there's no reason to amend the mission of this centre. There are 8 programs that were put in place by the CRA to manage the public health crisis. Therefore, the federal agency needs reinvestment in order to deal with all the extra workload. It is so important that there be fresh investments so that CRA can maintain the jobs that currently exist in Quebec. In order to provide quality delivery of services in French, federal organisations and departments must hire francophones to work in Quebec. Revenue Quebec would benefit from the expertise of employees from the CRA that could be transferred to the provincial agency and maintain their portfolios. This would not be creating a precedent. In closing, we would call on the same benefits: greater collaboration between the two agencies in terms of information sharing under federal treaties, a single tax return. Each tax authority must have all the information at its disposal to ensure that all taxpayers pay their fair share.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Sylvester. Then turning to the last panelist with the Union of Taxation Employees, Marc Briere, National President. Go ahead, Mr. Briere.
Thank you. Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs les députés.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, members of Parliament. I'm the President of the Union of Taxation Employees, and I'd like to thank you for giving me this opportunity to take part in today's discussion concerning Bill C-224. The Union of Taxation Employees falls under the Public Service of Canada and accounts for several thousand workers. The purpose of the bill that's been introduced by the Member for Parliament of Joliette, Mr. Gabriel Sainte-Marie, would ensure that the federal government cedes to Quebec the administration of tax revenues. I can understand the political motivations of this member's bill. However, there are no other good reasons aside from sovereignty that would justify or warrant adopting Bill C-224. First, it's clear that there will be massive job losses were this bill to be enacted. And if the federal government were to entrust the Quebec government with this task. Indeed, CRA currently employs 6,000 individuals in Quebec, and our union accounts for several hundred employees. Together, the two agencies have a combined staff of 18,000 individuals. Now, if you compare that with the CRA's staff numbers elsewhere in the country, quite clearly there would be a surplus of staff in Quebec were this bill enacted. The Premier of Quebec, Mr. François Legault, stated in an interview to the Devoir newspaper in January 2019, and I quote, "Quite clearly there will be job losses." The Premier also stressed that only those individuals working at Revenue Quebec would keep their jobs. I don't necessarily agree with him, but that's what he said. I should also point out that the lion's share of jobs lost are held by Quebecers who live and work and pay taxes in Quebec and to contribute to the vitality of Quebec. These are Quebecers, first and foremost.
Job losses are more than 1,200 employees in the Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean region and 1,500 in Mauricie. The bill calls for measures to be put in place to mitigate the job losses that will be inevitable. While I have been looking for a realistic solution to this problem, I have yet to find one. Now, I also need to point out that the idea itself of creating a single tax return in Quebec is not the solution, at least not at this time. Now, this is not coming from me. This is according to Quebec tax experts who met in May 2019 in Sherbrooke. And according to those experts, the solution is not applicable at the time and now. They said that international practices would prevent Quebec from being able to do a part of federal government's work in this area. The result of bilateral agreements negotiated solely between the central governments, like the government of Canada and other countries, cooperation agreements on, among other things, combating tax evasion do not usually allow the data to be shared with other levels of government. I know that the bill is asking to look into that, but I just want to point out that it took years for the CRA to negotiate these agreements with other countries, and it will take a long time, if it can happen, if the other countries agree, to make any changes to these agreements. But in any case, the real problem doesn't lie there. The bulk of the additional cost of tax compliance in Quebec doesn't arise from a redundancy issue, according to François Vaillancourt, a renowned Quebec tax expert. It comes from the tax policy differences between the two levels of government, because there are two tax law, one provincial, one federal. So he said, and I quote, "As long as we have to comply with two different sets of legislation, we cannot hope to achieve such huge savings." Now, the experts therefore suggest that Quebec and Ottawa harmonize their tax policies before even thinking about creating a single tax return. And according to those experts, if the objective is solely to reduce redundancies and achieve efficiencies, it would be more logical to entrust the work to the agency that is most capable of achieving large-scale savings, namely the Canada Revenue Agency. I suggest that this is why the 9 other provinces are counting on the CRA to do the work. In its report published in June 2015, the Robillard Commission, commissioned by the Quebec government itself, came to the conclusion that transferring the tax administration activities from Revenue Quebec to the Canada Revenue Agency would result in direct annual savings of approximately $400 million for the Quebec government. Selon nous, si le Québec...
In our opinion, if Quebec were to administer the federal government's taxes in Quebec, its autonomy would in fact be reduced. first and foremost, there is a difference in the definition of revenue between the two governments. I'd be pleased to respond to all your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for your presentations. The question lineup is first Mr. Berthold for the official opposition, Ms. Koutrakis, Mr. St. Marie, and Mr. Julian. In the 6-minute round, Mr. Berthold, the floor is yours.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And first, thank you to our witnesses. You've shed a lot of light on this particular issue today. We have before us a bill that would provide for the harmonization of the tax regimes in Quebec, i.e. collecting and management of taxes administered by the Quebec government. I should stress that the Conservative government put Quebecers at the heart of this call for a single tax return. That was what was called for. However, what we see before us with this bill, well, we think that it's possible to facilitate Quebecers' lives without an entire overhaul of the system, lock, stock and barrel. So I'd like to hear from all three witnesses on this particular point. Do you think it's impossible to ensure that Quebecers receive one form and that the form be sent to both tax agencies so that they can more easily process that information? All I'm saying is that the information would be on one single form. We were told by the CRA that that was possible. So I'd like to hear your opinion. Is it realistic? Is it feasible? Is it possible? And would this be simpler than harmonizing the two tax systems? Would it be simpler than transferring authorities and powers in the manner described? Please go ahead, Ms. Devio.
Ms. Davio, if you would start.
Yeah, if I could please ask Monsieur Couillard to respond, because he is actually an employee of Canada Revenue Agency in Quebec. Jean?
Mr. Couillard?
Oui, bonjour.
Yes, Jean Couillard. I'm the CRA auditor. We know that already, Mr. Couillard. We'd just like you to answer the question because we don't have much time. Thank you. Well, it's quite complicated to have both tax returns on one single form. There are major differences. When it comes to, it depends whether it is a corporate tax return or an individual's tax return, because there are major differences between both systems. So it would be difficult to have it on the one single form. Question, Mr. Sylvestre, the question is for you now. Well, I'll call on Mr. Caron to respond to your question. Well, it's my sense that it would be fairly complicated to have a single tax return, but to have both agencies playing a separate role. And I think we're missing the objective here. That is to take sums of money and reallocating them elsewhere where they're needed. And now, the Syndicat de la Fonction Publique? Yes, or the Union of Taxation Employees. It's going to be highly complicated. Let me put it to you plainly. There will be no savings. And let me give you a specific reason. There is a major difference between the provincial and the federal acts when it comes to the definition of income. If you have someone that has a private sickness insurance policy, well, it's an advantage for that individual to pay their taxes provincially rather than federally. So if you try and amalgamate that, sorry, I've got to stop you there, Mr. Brière. I understand your answer. It's going to be highly complicated. But what I don't understand is that for an employer, it's very easy to send one T4 and but why not just send a single formula and ask individuals to fill out, check the boxes, depending on which agency and province or is concerned. So that would be a simple process, wouldn't it? And taxpayers would simply need to check off the appropriate boxes to both agencies. The goal isn't to save taxpayers money or to make people lose their jobs. It's to simplify Quebecers' lives. But what we're trying to understand here is how can we achieve this? And I'm really surprised. We even had the CRA appear before us. It seems like it's impossible to make Quebecers' lives more straightforward by simply having them fill out one single tax return. It's a bit hard to swallow that. I just can't fathom why. Mr. Brière, you seem to be chomping at the bit to respond to that question, so I'll hand the floor to you.
To interrupt for a sec, Mr. Berthold, we have 2 hours today and only 3 witnesses, so there's ample time. We don't need to rush too much. Mr. Brière.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Bon, Monsieur Berthold.
Mr. Berthold, listen. The problem is that people have been talking about this for a long time. There's no solution because it's complicated. You're talking about one single form. Let me tell you that those who receive the T4 from the federal government and slip 1 from the provincial government will 95% of individuals hand it on to an accountant or to taxation software. So it's already been simplified because folks are doing it electronically. But what you need to remember is that there is the federal legislation and the provincial legislation. Everywhere else, there's only one piece of legislation. But the fact is, between Quebec's provincial legislation and the federal legislation, there are a whole slew of differences. It would be very difficult to harmonise. Quebec could lose over $500 million annually if this was harmonized. So it would cost $3.8 billion for Canadian taxpayers, and that's a huge problem to my mind. Ms. Devio.
I do. Thank you so much. If we really want there to be less paperwork and tax filing burden on individuals and help ensure that people get the benefits they're entitled to, what really should be supported is the move to the automated tax filing form, which we advocate for and which the government says it's going to be looking to implement. There are ways to simplify Quebec taxes, as I mentioned in my presentation, without completely overhauling both the Quebec and federal tax regimes. So in answer to your question, yes, there are easier ways to simplify the burden for Quebec taxpayers, but in our view, this isn't the way that's efficient, and it's certainly going to be extremely costly. Whatever savings might be realized down the road, maybe would be more than offset by the cost of resetting up all of these systems, treaties, informatics systems, processes, and hiring all of the people to do this work.
Okay, we will have to move on, but if there's any other witnesses want to respond to that question, I'll give them a minute. Okay, we'll move on to Ms. Koutrakis, followed by Mr. St. Marie.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to thank the witnesses for their testimony this afternoon. My first question is directed at Ms. Devio. Last week, we heard from representatives from the CIA that suggested...
Point of order, Annie, and I think, go ahead, Pat. I think I know what it's on. Go ahead.
Yeah, just I wonder if Ms. Koutrakis has her language incorrectly set, because we've got translation and floor volume at the same level.
Guilty as charged. Sorry.
No problem.
Go ahead,
Sorry
Annie.
about that. I'll start again.
Last week, we heard from witnesses from the CRA that suggested that the high cost of transferring the administration of taxation to the province would cost $800 million. This would be a set overheads due to the cost of new IT equipment as the changes in terms of human resources and personnel. Could you please comment on that estimate and let the committee know what your thoughts are as to the potential cost of this transition?
For the question, I really don't know what the numbers are. We're not in a position to be able to do that calculation, but certainly the justification provided by the CRA for that number sounds reasonable. The only thing I could add to that is it's likely to be even more expensive than that, given that projects don't always go as anticipated. Additional costs arise during the project. If we're introducing new complicated IT systems, that hasn't always gone smoothly at either the provincial or federal government levels. And so, there's really a lot of risk associated with changing something that actually works. Because let's face it, our tax system works. It's just a little complicated for people living in Quebec, or more complicated for those living in Quebec. And as I said, that could easily be solved by centralizing the administration with the CRA, who already has all of the systems in place, all of the processes in place, and all of the expert knowledge and auditors able to do that as they do for other provinces.
Back to you, Ms. Katrakis. If other witnesses want to add in the response, just raise your hand, and if I don't see you, yell. Ms. Katrakis.
Madame Davio, pouvez-vous?
Ms. Davio, could you please provide an estimation of the cost savings and the enhanced efficiency were the CRA to administer personal income tax for the province of Quebec? Why, in your opinion, would the CRA be more efficient and effective in administering individual personal income tax returns? I know that you gave some information, but if you could elaborate on that, please.
Well, I'm not at all sure that they would do the job better or worse than the people who are doing it in the province. What I'm suggesting is that if you want to simplify it under one umbrella, that makes more sense to simplify it under the Canada Revenue Agency, where the systems are already in place, than it does to centralize under Revenue Quebec, where all of these systems would need to be built. All of the processes would need to be put in place. All of the staffing would need to be done. It's quite a transformation you're looking at to solve what is a pretty small problem in the scheme of things. And I just think that there are much better ways to go about simplifying taxes for the residents of Quebec. That'll be a lot less costly, both to individuals, to the government, and will not run the risk of losing thousands of jobs at a time when those jobs are so very important.
Mr. Briere wants in as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Bonjour, Madame Koutrakis.
Yes, Ms. Koutrakis. I'd like to talk about the savings that Quebec could make. Even the Commission Robillard that was put in place by the Premier in 2015 stated that Quebec would save millions of dollars annually by allowing the CRA to administer these taxes. It's not complicated. The federal government has its system in place across Canada. The 9 other provinces have, for their good reasons, decided to allow CRA to do this. Not because they like CRA, but because it's a good deal for them. The federal government doesn't bill the provinces to do this work. So the money is sent to the provinces, and perhaps you're not aware of this, but I'm a recovery agent or officer for the CRA. And what I can tell you is that the province will be paid, even if the federal government has to make a loss. So in addition to that, when it comes to the recovery of lost taxes, the province is paid first and the federal government second. So there are a lot of reasons for Quebec to do this. But from a political standpoint, it's a different kettle of fish, and I won't get into that, but it's a no-brainer. Mr. Chair, do I have any time left?
It's in Annie, and then we'll come back to you. Mr. Sylvester.
Merci beaucoup.
Yes, thank you very much. In our presentation, we talked about the commission that Mr. Brière referred to that was, in fact, cast aside by Revenue Quebec 3 years ago. And I should point out that we're talking about savings to the tune of hundreds of $millions annually by enabling the Quebec province to do this. This will cover the reorganization costs that would be borne by the CRA, I should point out. And just an aside, I should also say that, and I think Mr. Berthold referred to the two forms. It does get a tad complicated, but it's a question of IT matters. And I think that I've forgotten the person's name, but I think that when we're talking about efficient IT systems, Revenue Quebec is more than capable of taking charge of this, and they do so for thousands of programs also. I'd also tell you that when it comes to job losses, the CRA gave the Quebec province management responsibilities for the QST years ago, and there were no problems there. Mr. Chairman, do I have time for one more question?
Very short one, and then I'll let Mr. Couillard in as well. Go ahead, Annie. Very short.
OK, j'aimerais savoir.
I'd like to know, in addition to the loss of these tens of thousands thousands of jobs, the organisation, Mr. Brière, suggested that a single taxpayer system administered by Revenue Quebec would also lead to a loss of about $800 million in wages and salaries. Could you talk about the impact on these revenue losses on the local economy where the CRA employees live and work? Response: well, it would be devastating for the region of Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean and for the region of the Mauricie. The CRA is the biggest employer in Mauricie and the second biggest along with the mines in the Saguenay. We're talking about thousands of jobs, and I can tell you that it's probably even more nowadays. And these folks are spending money that stimulates the economy. They have substantial wages, and they have enjoy a higher wage than their provincial counterparts. So this would put a huge hole in the public finances. I wouldn't want to live in Mauricie if the CRA picked up and shut up shop. It would be devastating to the Mauricie region. Thank you.
Okay, and Mr. Couillard had a point he wanted to raise, and then we'll go on to Mr. St. Marie. Mr. Couillard?
Oui, je voudrais juste
Well, I'd just like to add to what was said, i.e. allowing the federal government to manage taxation. When it comes to the tax treaties that are signed with other countries in terms of sharing of information, I think that we are well represented at a federal level in our offices. We have folks that work for the International Taxation Division. Would the province be able to do that without additional costs in order to reinvent the wheel and go after tax accords and agreements with other countries and enter into tax treaties? And would the other nations of the world want to enter into agreements with a province rather than a country? Thank you.
Thank you all. Mr. St. Marie, followed by Mr. Julian and Gabriel. We're giving everybody an 8-minute first round, it seems, today, so you're on.
OK, merci, Wayne.
Thank you very much, Wayne. I'd like to thank all of the guests and witnesses for being here today, and thank you for your presentations. It was highly interesting, despite the fact that there's clearly a lack of a consensus around the table. This is quite a polemic issue. And I'd like to refer to what Mr. Couillard just said. What this bill is calling for, in fact, is that Ottawa would agree to mandate Revenue Quebec to have access to or to facilitate the exchange of information. And it's not that complicated. I think it would be by a process of amendment, and the Government of Canada would indicate to Barbados that Revenue Quebec was authorized to go and collect this information, quite simply. And when it comes to combating tax havens, well, both legal and illegal, Canada is at the bottom of the list when it comes to efforts to combat tax havens. And this legislation will enable Quebec to combat tax havens more effectively and efficiently. I don't want to point the finger at any CRA employee. This was a decision by the centralized government. But at the end of the day, this legislation will help us combat tax avoidance and tax evasion. Now, Mr. Berthold talked about harmonisation on a number of occasions. This is my legislation, and I'm telling you that there is no question of wanting to harmonise. There's going to be one single tax return that would be sent to Revenue Quebec. That information would then be referred to the CRA. So we're not talking about getting rid of jobs, CRA jobs. It would just be a question of making taxpayers' lives more easy. And Revenue Quebec would have a one-stop shop which would simplify Quebecers' lives, and information could be shared in that manner. Under the bill, we would call on Ottawa to enter into negotiations with Quebec within 90 days of the bills coming into force. And Quebec and Ottawa would be called upon to come to an agreement. Now, I was just told here that I brought this bill to Parliament because I'm sovereigntist. It is true that I'm a sovereigntist, but that's not what this is about. I am tabled this legislation because there's a consensus at the Quebec National Assembly. All the parties, provincially, political parties, Quebec, have been calling for this. Last week, I quoted the economics critic for Quebec Solidaire, who's also calling for it. And the Premier, Mr. Legault, officially called upon Prime Minister Trudeau to proceed in this manner in order to simplify Quebecers' lives. And elsewhere, why not just have a single tax form? And if I'm not mistaken, the House of Commons recognised that Quebec was a fully fledged nation. And so therefore, can the Canadian nation accommodate the Quebec nation, given that this is a unanimous call from Quebec's National Assembly? It's a simple fact that, and I am very concerned, of course, about job losses. I'm not taking this lightly. The goal of this legislation would be that if there are two people doing the same task, one in Quebec City, one in Ottawa, why have this duplication? Why not use that money to hire federal public servants where there are not enough? And in addition to that, Mr. Sylvestre, in your opening remarks, you said that you had specific examples in the past of jobs from other public services that became part of the Quebec Public Service. If you could please give us those specific examples and take whatever time you need to do in doing so. Response. Thank you very much for the question. Yes?
We'll start with Ms. Davio and on to Mr. BR.
Yeah, I just wanted to address the issue of tax evasion. It is not a simple matter, that's for sure. And as a union that represents most of the auditors at Canada Revenue Agency engaged in this work of going after tax avoiders and tax cheats and getting offshore money, I can tell you that very complex systems are needed. Very complex interactions between jurisdictions are required. And I don't think you can water that down by having provinces versus federal. It's already very difficult to get this information from countries, even countries we have treaties with, to get complete sets of information. And if you really want to address the problem of tax evasion, then what the money should be spent on is not rebuilding a whole new system in Quebec, but rather investing in the areas required federally, like technology and training for people who are up against some of the most complicated technology and some of the most expert tax avoiders in the world. And so, there is a lot of work that can be done to improve Canada's tax system. But if you want to get back to the issue that of making things more simplified for Quebecers, there is a way to do that, and it doesn't require a complete overhaul of both the Quebec provincial and federal systems to do that. That's likely just to create turmoil and a whole bunch of risk about outcomes for our ability to continue to collect taxes.
Mr. Bier.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Monsieur Sainte-Marie.
Mr. Sainte-Marie, well, first, I respect your political convictions, no worries, but what I was referring to in my open remarks is that, yes, this might make sense that Revenue Quebec looks after Quebec's tax. Were Quebec a country, but it is a province in a federalized system, and therefore this is not a good solution. You don't have to trust me. Trust all the experts in Quebec that are saying leave this to the CRA, because the CRA has more tools. Let me give you an example. Revenue Quebec has its area of jurisdiction is Quebec. If someone leaves Quebec, now I live in Gatineau. If I go and live in Ottawa and I owe money to Revenue Quebec and I take all my assets out of Quebec and I have none left there and my work is in Ottawa, my employer's in Ottawa, and I come from the recovery division, I know what's going to happen. The employer's going to say, I don't recognize your claim because you don't fall under our jurisdiction. So the CRA can ensure that I pay my taxes if I owe taxes, even if I go to the United States. I've already been part of a process where the CRA has asked the IRS in the United States to pay money, and Revenue Quebec wouldn't be able to do that. So I just want to point that out. There are a lot of advantages to leaving the CRA to do this job. I'd also point out that when you talk about jobs, well, there are going to be a whole lot of job losses in Quebec, and the Premier of Quebec was honest enough to say this. And for those who are not from Quebec among you, there will be CRA job losses elsewhere in Canada because there are folks that process Quebecers' tax returns in call centres in Vancouver, in Edmonton, and so there is also tax form processing in Winnipeg, in Sudbury, and folks working all across the country in the recovery divisions.
We are going to leave it there and go on to Mr. Julian for 8 minutes.
Mr. Easter, with all due respect, I had asked a specific question of Mr. Sylvestre, and I'd like time to be allocated for his response.
Sylvestre put up his hand. Go ahead, Mr. Sylvestre.
Yes, very quickly. Thank you very much for your question. There were 2 or 3 examples given. Now, the 2 flagrant examples are the GST and the QST that were merged in the 90s. And everyone said that there would be job losses in the 90s and that there was not a single job loss. So when it comes to job losses, I'd like concrete examples that are evidence-based and backed up. Just simply saying that there's going to be job losses by virtue of a merger, well, there needs to be evidence of this. And the evidence that we looked at came out of 2 studies. And the Ministry of Financial Solidarity in Quebec in the early 2000s also found that there were no job losses either across Quebec or in the regions. Those folks kept their salaries, they kept their jobs, and there was no one that was laid off. That was the agreement between the federal government and the province at the time. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. You managed to squeeze in 10 minutes there, Gabriel. Going to Mr. Julian, followed by Mr. Kelly. Peter?
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président, et merci.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much to our witnesses. And we hope that during this pandemic, your families remain healthy and well, and we appreciate your devotion in the service of the public, both in Quebec and federally. The New Democratic Party voted in favour at second reading of this bill, sponsored by my friend Mr. Centenary, who's a very dedicated member of Parliament. Now, we did so because we agree with the principle of a single tax return, but with the following caveat, that there are no job losses. And that is something that we have always called for in the past in relation to a single tax return. My first question will be directed to Mr. Brière. Thank you very much for your attendance here today, Mr. Brière. I was a tad concerned because last week, Mr. Terrien, who's the House leader for the Bloc, he said last Tuesday in a committee meeting that according to the Minister for National Revenue, over 5,300 jobs are used for the processing of tax returns. Now, if because of duplication, 44% of the 5,300 workers, well, then that would be an absolute disgrace. And I was shocked by that comment. To me, it flies in the face of what we're trying to do with this particular bill. Now, Mr. Brière, my first question is about that, essentially. Do you believe that only 44% of the 5,300 people in Quebec that are processing these forms and tax returns are useful or not useful? Well, yes, they are very useful. All the employees of revenue of the CRA work there in Quebec. When I say that there is only 6,000, if you compare it to the 45,000 across Canada, it's because in Quebec we ceded the administration of the GST. But this is peanuts compared to what we're talking about here. So there are folks that do auditing, there are folks that do collections, there are folks that working in IT. Right across the board, there are a lot of jobs being done in Quebec for the benefit of Quebecers, and sometimes there's a workload that comes from outside Quebec. But let's not forget that were such a change to occur, the CIA would have no incentive to keep jobs in Shawinigan and elsewhere. So they could transfer these jobs elsewhere in the country. There would be beautiful buildings that would end up empty. There are collections folks that work for Revenue Quebec, and I can tell you that I worked at Revenue Quebec before I transferred to the CRA, so I know both agencies. There are collections and auditors' job in both agencies.
Merci, Monsieur Brière.
Thank you, Mr. Brière. Now, I'd like to know what the impact will be on the region of Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean and on the Mauricie. And I should say right off the bat that I used to live in Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean. I learned my French in Chicoutimi. And I'm hell-bent on the idea of ensuring that jobs in the regions, such as Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean, be kept. But based on the comment that I just cited, that doesn't seem to be the ultimate objective here. And I don't share the opinion that by cutting back all of these positions, that it will in some way benefit the regions. So let me get to the essence of my question. What will be the impact on these job losses in Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean and in the Mauricie? What will be the regional impacts? Well, listen, as I said earlier, there'll be a substantial impact when it comes to jobs. There'll be 1,200 jobs in Saguenay that will be lost at a minimum, and over 1,000 in the Mauricie. So we're talking about millions and millions of dollars in wages lost in both regions. And of course, those folks that have been spending money in these regions will not do so in the future. And let me congratulate you on your French in passing. It's quite clear that you improved your French by living in Quebec. But the Jonquière Centre is rare. Quebec has most of its tax centres in Quebec, located in Quebec. So were there to be only one single tax return, there'd be no need to keep the Jonquière Centre open. It could be transferred to other regions. So in that particular region, quite clearly, those jobs wouldn't be necessary anymore. And there would be no tax returns to be processed because the federal T1 would no longer exist. There'd be a single tax return. So not only is it complicated, but those folks would become surplus employees. And I should point out that in Jonquière and Shawinigan, there are a lot of contract temporary employees that have no job security. And if this kind of thing occurs, they're going to lose their job. They have no income security. And overnight, there'll be thousands and thousands of CRA employees that will lose their jobs. They're extremely vulnerable. And in passing, I should point out that there are a lot of similar folks with precarious employment at Revenue Quebec. So I would be fighting. I don't want this to occur to these workers. Well, you referred to
Peter, Ms. Davio wants to make a quick comment, then I'll come back to you for the last question this round. Ms. Davio?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I also live in Quebec. I live in Gatineau and I work in Ontario. And don't get me wrong, I would love to see a simplified tax system. I really struggle with this. But I'm not willing to put thousands of jobs on the line for that. I'm not willing to put potentially $1 billion investment into that. Just to simplify a system that is working but is maybe a little bit complicated. I think those investments could be much better made in improving the overall system federally and provincially, but this is not the way. And the risk is great to jobs. And so when you say, Mr. Julian, that you want, you support this with the caveat that jobs will be protected, it's not possible, in my view. It is not possible that jobs won't be affected in this type of transfer.
A very quick question, Mr. Julian, and I know Mr. Couillard wants in as well. So, Mr. Julian?
Merci, mais je vais revenir.
Thank you. Mr. Brière, has the Union of Taxation Employees conducted a study regarding the number of small and medium-sized companies that would be affected were there to be a loss of 3,000 jobs in those two regions? In other words, well, there are direct and indirect jobs. Have there been any studies conducted on job losses, indirect job losses in those two regions?
Answer, Mr. Brière, and I want to get Mr. Couillard last words. Couillard.
Sure, Mr. Chair. Écoutez, on n'a pas fait.
Well, no, we haven't conducted any study, but there's obviously going to be millions of dollars in lost revenue in Quebec. We don't know how many thousand jobs will be lost exactly, but clearly these employees spend money in the towns and villages. Just go and visit Shawinigan and you'll realize very quickly that were this auditing centre to close, it would be shocking. It'd be a catastrophe. It'd be terrible in the Saguenay and for the Mauricie. And anyone from the Mauricie would tell you there would be a disaster for that region.
Mr. Couillard, last word to you.
Oui, bonjour, Monsieur Julien. Oui, effectivement, votre français est très...
Yes, your French is excellent, and congratulations that you are clearly making an effort. Now, we're talking a lot about Shawinigan and Jonquière and job losses, But quite clearly, there are taxation centres in Quebec, in other areas, in Rouen, in Chicoutimi, in Sherbrooke, Rimouski, Montréal, Trois-Rivières, Gatineau, Quebec City, Brossard, and Laval. So clearly, all of those locations will be affected, but we don't know how exactly, and we don't know what this will look like at the end of the day.
We'll go to Mr. Kelly, followed by Mr. Fragaskatis, and 5-minute rounds. We're going to have to hold to it. Pat. All
right. Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. It's interesting. So if I really understand correctly, the Institute of Public Service would, in a perfect world, conceive of a single return to make it simple, but that it ought to be the CRA that administers it. If I understand the Syndicat de la Fonction Publique et Parapublique du Québec, kind of the opposite, that there ought to be a single return and it ought to be done by Revenu Quebec. And if I understood Monsieur Brière correctly, the two returns is a symptom of the problem rather than the problem itself, and that the definitions of income and the complications are the problem rather than the fact of the two returns, and that one cannot be addressed without the other. So somewhat lost in this discussion, I guess, is the poor suffering Quebec tax filer that has to file two returns to two different institutions. I am not a Quebec tax filer, and I've never filed a Quebec tax return, but one doesn't need to be so to grasp just how inconvenient and expensive this must be, with very high incidence of filers being compelled to seek professional assistance in filing the returns. We've got to solve this somehow and get our Quebec tax filers some relief from the burden of compliance. So if I'm happy to have each witness maybe comment on from that point of view, the point of view of the Quebec tax filer and delivering some relief from the cost and burden and complication of complying with the law.
Okay, we'll start with Mr. Brière and then on to Mr. Sylvestre.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Kelly, for the question. I am a Quebec tax filer, so I know what it's like. Yes, there's two tax returns, but as I mentioned before, if you go back years ago, I mean, the point would have been more, accurate. But right now, I don't like it because it's not necessarily good for jobs as a union leader. But the fact of the matter is, people are filing electronically. So when you file your taxes electronically in Quebec, you punch in your numbers and the system allocated to the two returns. And then you just go and you click and you send it to Revenu Quebec, you click, you send it to Revenu Canada. So from that perspective, it's not that complicated. And another thing that people are thinking about, the taxpayers and lessening the burden on them, people are paying their accountant, let's say, to do their taxes, right? Accountants will not chop their price in half if there's only one tax return, because they use software too. Trust me, you can ask them. Don't count on my answer. Ask tax expert; they'll tell you. So there won't be any savings. It will be more complicated. And this bill is, saying that give it to Quebec. Well, I'm sorry, and it's not because I'm not the federal government. It doesn't make any sense to give it to the province of Quebec instead of the federal government. So the problem is.
Sorry to interrupt. I know that I invited the other witnesses to answer too, but I want to follow up on a point there. Yeah. And I don't know I'm asking this question because I don't know the answer. Is the incidence of professional filing, the number of Quebecers that have to that pay somebody else to prepare their returns, how does that compare to the rest of the country?
Okay, could we go to Mr. Sylvestre first and then back to Mr. Brière on that one? Mr. Sylvestre, you want in? Mr. Sylvestre?
Pour répondre à Monsieur Kelly.
To answer Mr. Kelly's question, I'm also a taxpayer from Quebec, and yes, it's complicated to have two tax filings. So the question was, what are the stats? How many Quebecers use experts for their tax filings? Well, it would be hard to come up with the numbers. We would need a national survey. But here's what concerns me most. You're talking about taxpayers' money. One of our arguments is that it would be great savings for both levels of governments, $425 million a year. Someone mentioned that we would need $1 billion to change the system, but we're telling you that every year $425 million would be saved. So over a 10-year period, we would be saving several billion dollars. So the cost to restructure the system would be paid for. So let's not look at costs in the short term. Let's look at the long term. Someone once told me, politicians need to think of the next generation. I think it's important. So if if there was a single tax filing in Quebec, and if we were to lose money, imagine if we were to do the opposite. If we were going to go back to what was the case in the 50s, and the federal government was responsible for everything, we would be losing 50,000 jobs. So I don't want anyone to lose their job. But based on the Quebec experience in the past, when two departments were merged, no jobs were lost. So try to show me that there will be job losses. We don't really have any evidence because we have no studies.
Pierre or Ms. Davio, do you have an answer on the numbers?
Well, actually, I'm trying to answer the question asked by Mr. Kelly. Like, how much is it more complicated in Quebec than elsewhere, right? Okay, well, it's obvious. It's easy. There's two bills. There's the Quebec tax law and the federal tax law. That's why it's more complicated, because Quebec created its own tax law. And that's okay. That's prerogative of the province. They can do it, it's legit, but that's why it's more complicated. So the experts are saying, as long as you will have two income tax act different, with huge differences, and the Quebec Tax Act is very complicated, then it's hope, like there's no hope to make this simple for people. So there's two bills, there's two acts. So until that's addressed and harmonized, seriously, it's like we're dreaming in Technicolor to have one income tax return. If I can make that simple.
I'm sorry. We're going to go on to Mr. Fragascatis, Mr. Peter, and then on to Mr. St. Marie for a short question. Mr. Peter.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the witnesses. I think it needs to be said, Mr. Chair, that among the members of Parliament on the committee that have sat with Mr. Saint-Marie, we recognize him for what he is, someone that only makes contributions to this committee, someone who brings a wealth of economic knowledge to the committee, as someone who has been an outstanding colleague and very easy to work with over the years. I say that because Mr. Briere, with all due respect, at the outset of your presentation, you said that the bill reflects the political convictions of the member, emphasizing the word political. Unless I misunderstood you, of course, but I think that if there is disagreements, we're going to focus on policy here. And I just wanted to make that comment and put it on the record. But I did want to begin with you, Mr. Briere, if I could. You talk about job losses. I did not hear, though, anywhere in your presentation about the average pay of public servants, those who would lose their job if this bill went through. What is their average pay? What you talked about well-paying jobs, as did Ms. Davio. But do you have numbers there that you could share?
Mr. Briere.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, I just want to mention that I did not mean any disrespect when I talked about politics. And I know the intent is to try to make the life of Quebecers easier. It was just something that was obvious to me, but I want to focus on policies as well. So if I offended anybody, I apologize for that.
No problem.
The question you asked, I'm not going to talk for my members, the members of the Union of Taxation and Employees are not my members. I'm only the national president. I'd say about $55K a year on average. maybe 55, 60. We had a bargain agreement that we signed after 4 years without a contract. So now we got a good contract, about 55, 60. And the members that Mrs. Davio represent have higher salaries. They got different jobs. So,
okay.
and it varies greatly.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Davio?
Yeah, my members, for the most part, are working on corporate, large corporate taxes and not on individuals' taxes as Mr. Briere's members, but they do earn slightly more. I don't have the average, but because of the knowledge and aptitudes required to work on those complex international and large corporate files.
Thank you very much. I wonder if we could focus just a little bit more, Ms. Davio, I'll stay with you. Your comment on the unintended consequences of the bill. You talked about balkanization in the tax system. Could you expand on that just a bit?
Well, for sure. And, I'm not a tax expert, honestly. I've just educated myself on this issue and looked at a lot of experts, writings on this. And all of the evidence shows that the more we decentralize the tax system, the more regressive that tax system becomes. So, for example, C. Lee in 2007, Kesselman and Chung in 2004. And as Lee and many experts have found, the progressivity in Canada's tax system largely stems from federal taxes. This is even more the case now as the federal government has introduced some more progressive tax measures at both the top and bottom ends of the tax system, and it's driven not just by politics but also by imperatives. We have much better, much greater interregional than international mobility, and so it's really important that the feds are involved in the development of the policy and the administration and the collection of taxes. Otherwise, what we might see and what we have seen historically is eroding tax fairness in Canada, where a breakdown. Where models show that there has been clearly there have been progressivity that stems from federal taxes, and that those are supported in a lot of studies. As I mentioned during my presentation, I'd be happy to provide the committee with links and copies to those various studies. But all the experts say the same thing. They say that progressivity and tax fairness dissipates as we decentralize the tax system and allow provinces, more autonomous ability to do what they need to do, and that isn't always in line with the best interest of all Canadians.
We are going to have to move on to Mr. Saint-Marie, 2.5 minutes, followed by Mr. Julian, the same. Gabriel.
Oui, merci Wayne. Juste là-dessus, à ma connaissance.
Thank you, Wayne. As far as I know, the tax system in Quebec is far more progressive than Ottawa. I understand your argument in theory, but in fact, that's not what it's about. I think that we're off topic, speaking of that, because the bill's purpose isn't to harmonize, saying you'll have the same levels of taxation. Taxpayers, corporations file their taxes. They call one number instead of two numbers. And after that, Revenue Quebec transfers the information to CRA. And after that, each of the acts would apply, or the legislation would apply. We're not asking Ottawa to harmonize its tax rules with Quebec's. That's not at all what it's about. So I just wanted to clarify that. Mr. Julian came back to Mr. Terrien's statement. I know my colleague very well. He might have cut corners in what he said, But if two employees, one at CRI, one at Revenue Quebec, do the same job, could we not use the resources more efficiently? And job losses, 1,200, 1,500, as far as I see it, it's out of the question to threaten those jobs here. But if two people do the same job, we could make sure that we're more efficient with a single person doing that task or job. And that's why the bill was written, to ask the government to preserve the jobs either in Quebec or with other tasks. And then that would be up to Ottawa. Of course, I want to preserve jobs absolutely in the regions. Mr. Sylvestre could say a few words on the issues. So Mr. Sylvestre and Ms. Davio. Thank you. I think Mr. Kelly said a few words about this. The main thing here, to simplify the single tax return, it would make a big difference in Quebec. Filing two income tax returns is complicated in Quebec, but on our end, as a union, we've been defending that position for 3 years. There are savings to be made. Job losses. We're not here. We're not at the right place. We're not a union that defends its members. If we threaten jobs in Quebec, saving 400 million or 400 to 425 million annually, that's a lot of money. When merging both could cost up to 800 million, as was stated, that would pay for itself a few years after merging. That's why we need a long-term vision here. If we keep only a short-term vision, there isn't any advantage here. But if we send jobs elsewhere, federally, those jobs could be recovered elsewhere. People could work elsewhere. There's a shortage of labor throughout the country and Quebec as well.
A very quick answer from Ms. Davio, and then we'll let him move on to Mr. Julian.
Just to say that the question ought not to be, should Canada take over Quebec's taxes or should Quebec take over Canada's taxes? The question ought to be, how do we simplify taxes for Quebec residents? And I certainly think there's a way. I mentioned automatic tax filing that would help a large percentage of individuals to not have to deal with a complex two-form system. There are ways to manage this without overhauling and investing huge amounts of money and taking the risks that the end result doesn't work as well as the product we have today. And that's all I wanted to throw in there.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Julian, and on to Mr. Falk. Peter?
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Puis j'ai 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have 3 minutes if I've understood you correctly.
3.
T'es super gentil, merci.
Gee whiz, you're great, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. How generous. Let me come back to you, Mr. Brière, and also to you, Mr. Couillard, on the issue of tax havens. You raised that particular point, and you said that it will be harder to combat tax havens by proceeding in this manner. So, in my opinion, that hasn't been confirmed. Now, if those jobs are transferred, those jobs that would be normally dedicated to combating tax havens, well, if you could extend that logic and come to the conclusion that we could combat tax havens even more effectively. Now, if these employees from the Mauricie and Jonquière were transferred, and they worked for the CARA and focused on tax avoidance, tax havens, tax loopholes, and is that, could we then use that money, those proceeds from tax havens that the Parliamentary Budget Officer has estimated to be huge? Could we use that, put those to good use?
Mr. Briere.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Merci, Mr. Julien.
Well, unfortunately, Mr. Julien, as I said, in 2019, in the election campaign, the Conservative Party alluded to that possibility that folks that would lose their Quebec from the CRA in Shawinigan and Jonquière, could they be retrained and become specialists in tax avoidance? And it is unthinkable, it's impossible, and our members all have training that is not perhaps up to the task of combating tax avoidance. You need specific qualifications. It takes years of experience at the CRA to do that job. And those folks in Jonquière who process our tax returns would never be qualified. It would take years for them to become qualified, do studies, get experience to be able to do that job. Would they end up without a job, those people? Well, I think they would, because there aren't thousands of jobs just waiting about in Saguenay for those people. And the same is true of the Mauricie. And I should point out that elsewhere in Quebec, there are folks in Laval, in Montreal. They would lose their jobs, and it would be difficult to replace those jobs unless they went to Revenue Quebec. There are 18,000 folks that work and they would lose their jobs. And also, Mr. Sainte-Marie, you have cited examples that there wouldn't be any job losses because of the transfers. In the hospital Saint-Anne-de-Bellevue, you'll recall that it was a catastrophe. It was a lot of job losses, a complete disaster. Well, we can talk about that at a later occasion, says Mr. Sainte-Marie.
We're going to move on to Mr. Bach and hopefully...
Excuse.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, I'd asked Mr. Couillard the same question, if you recall. Yes, I agree with Mr. Briere. I'll respond quickly. I agree with Mr. Briere. When it comes to tax services, this occurs in Laval, Montreal, in terms of International Tax Division.
Okay, hopefully, Mr. Sylvestre, you'll be able to come in on the next round, because we do have to move on. Mr. Falk, followed by Mr. Zerowitz, 5-minute rounds.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And thank you to the witnesses for coming here today and giving your opinions and perspective on this issue. You know, I can't imagine having to file 2 tax returns. I think it would be very burdensome. And I think the concept, the idea of having a single tax return for all Canadians is a great concept. But can you as witnesses give me a cost benefit? My accountant, he's always asking me the cost benefit. What's the cost and what's the benefit? You know, from and outside of an employee perspective, because my experience with CRA is that we've never had too many CRA employees. At least whenever I've wanted to get something resolved, it's hard to find people that have the time to deal with the situation. So I don't think anybody needs to lose their job, even if we streamline our processes a little bit. But if you could give me a brief cost benefit analysis of doing this or not doing it.
Who wants to start? Mr. Ms. Dabio? Did I see your hand up?
Sure, I'll start. We don't have the actual numbers, so we're speaking in generalities. Those numbers you can get from CRA or from Revenue Quebec. But I can tell you this is like a make work project. It's every dollar that is spent transferring this responsibility to the province of Quebec is money lost, money that could have better been invested in other areas, in tax evasion, if you will. I mean, I represent the auditors who work in tax evasion and international taxes. they're begging for additional resources for systems that that are more complex and can battle some of the systems they're working against, for the education and knowledge and expertise required to continue to go after that money. So there's a lot of ways that you could improve in that area without looking at this. And again, I want to go back to the intent. If the intent is to simplify for Quebecers, there is a way to simplify for Quebecers without this massive overhaul on both the provincial and federal taxes. And that's what we ought to be what you ought to be focused on as a solution.
Mr. Sylvestre, you had your hand up there. Do you want in?
Oui, merci beaucoup.
Yes. Inaudible?
Monsieur Sylvestre,
Mr. Sylvestre, you're on mute. Oh, I apologize. I'd just like to turn back to tax havens. By opening the door to CRA officers not being able to do that work, well, it's a question of political will, and there's a greater political will in Quebec than Quebec City than there has been in Ottawa over recent years. We could enter into agreements with OECD countries to recover the money that's hidden in tax havens, but it's a lack of political will that's the real problem in Quebec. The government just introduced legislation, Bill 6078, on corporate transparency to determine where that money is flowing to. Quebec has been focusing on that for a long time. In our presentation, we talked about artificial intelligence to determine whether what people earn and what they have as assets actually matches up at the end of the day, and what kind of lifestyle they're leading. And I think that they have the tools that are needed. And I think that the CRA employees need to have that kind of training to hone their skills on tax evasion. And I don't think this would necessarily lead to job losses, but the money could be reinjected into the local economy.
Okay, I had Mr. Goodrow has had his hand up here, and he hasn't responded yet, so I'll let him in and then come to you, Ted. Mr. Goodrow.
Oui, je vous remercie beaucoup.
Yes, thank you very much. As far as savings are concerned, we could debate on the kinds of savings that we want to achieve, and various experts will have different opinions, whether it be provincially or federally. However, the whole debate on potential job losses were there to be a single tax return in Quebec, well, that attests to the fact that all players recognise that there is some level of duplication in the current system, and that inherent duplication is the subject of this debate on the single tax return. So which level of government should oversee the single tax return? Well, we're in favour of it being the purview of the province. Now, the provinces have said that some of the other provinces kind of have lost their fiscal autonomy, and Quebec isn't prepared to pay that price. So in that particular context, with that as a backdrop, were we to have a single tax return that would make savings and simplify Quebecers' lives, it could only be managed by Quebec for Quebecers. And if all players act in good faith, the institutional overhauls, well, that's already been achieved by the other provinces vis-a-vis the federal government. So why can't this happen in the other direction between the federal government and Quebec if everyone pitches in?
Okay, Ted, if you got a quick final question there.
I'll let others ask, Wayne.
Okay.
I think I've exceeded my time. Thanks.
Okay, Ms. Zerowitz. 5 minutes followed by Mr. Fast.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I thought I had 2.5 minutes, so I was going to talk really quickly.
No, you got 5.
Okay, great. Thank you. So thanks to everyone for their presentations. This is a super interesting conversation. My first question is to Ms. Daviau and Mr. Couillard. I know that we've had quite a bit of conversation about job losses. I know that we've talked quite a bit about the impact in Jonquière and Shawinigan, I think. And I know that when we were talking to government officials last week, we heard that there would be job losses also in Sudbury and in PEI. And then today I heard a whole slew of other cities, Vancouver, Edmonton, a whole slew of other cities. Do you have a little bit more specific numbers on the job losses outside of Quebec? If someone could elaborate on that, that would be appreciated.
Ms. Davio?
I'm sorry, I don't have the numbers, but probably could put them together for you and have them sent out to the committee. But why those other places is because Canada Revenue Agency is a federal organization, and more they've been trying to decentralize outside of Ottawa, which is something that seems to be desirable by most representatives. And make sure that there's a presence, a federal government presence in communities right across this country, and CRA is a big part of that. So a lot of work that's done is done, in a center. So, for example, in Sudbury, they might be processing a particular type of taxes for the whole country. And that's why this sort of bill will touch upon areas even outside of Quebec. But perhaps Jean could comment further on specifics of where he sees impact as he's actually there doing the work. But again, we can run the numbers at least of our members who work on Quebec taxes in one way or another. And sorry, I just don't want to forget, it's not just auditors, but also other professionals like IT folks that we also represent. And researchers and other categories that would be impacted by such a change. Jean?
And just before Mr. Couillard gets in, I just want to be very specific. If this bill goes through, my question is, what other jobs and how many other jobs in other cities across Canada would actually be impacted, whether it's direct auditors, direct people implicated in tax, whether it's IT officials, whether it's managers. So if you have some information today and then can give us more specifics, that would be fantastic. So Mr. Couillard, I think we'd love
probably would be an easier question for Canada Revenue Agency to answer, but we'll do our very best to put that together.
Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Couillard, and back to Mr. Briere. Mr. Couillard.
Oui, ça peut-être.
Yes. As Ms. Devio said, the CRA would be better positioned to answer that question. I don't have any figures to give you. Perhaps Mr. Briere, who raised his hand, might have figures at his disposal. So he's saying he does. I'll hand the floor to him.
Thank you.
Mr. Briere.
If I give you a precise number, so I will not do that. I can tell you there'd be hundreds of jobs easily. Could talk at least maybe even 1,000 jobs, but we can try to get numbers. Now you ask where, and I mentioned that in my opening remarks, I believe. I'm going to look at my screen because I don't know them all by heart. I'm not that good. We got call centers. During the tax season, people call call centers. Coming up, well, we've got some for individuals in Calgary and Hamilton, and we have bilingual agents or even, like unilingual agents that answer calls from different places around the country, including Quebec. So, and we also have a business window call centers in Saint John, New Brunswick, Toronto, and Edmonton. And we also have people processing tax returns, like huge centers in Sudbury and Winnipeg. And on top of that, we've got collections officers across the country that are working on national workload. And basically, if you think about it, 8 million Quebecers not dealing with Revenue Canada anymore, only with Revenue Quebec. So it would be major job losses in Quebec and a lot of other jobs affected in different locations around the country, without a doubt.
Mr. Goodrow, is your hand up for this round, or is it still from the other one? Mr. Goodrow? Okay. All right. We will move on to Mr. Fast, followed by Mr. McLeod. 5-minute round, Ed.
Mr. Chair, with your indulgence, I'd like to cede my time to Mr. Berthold.
Okay, Mr. Berthold, you're on.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, and thank you to my colleague, Mr. Fast, for ceding his time. Well, I think we're getting a bit off topic here. We're talking a lot about jobs, and if we were to work together, I think that we can find positive way of simplifying Quebecers' lives. And Ms. Davio is saying that it is possible to do so while maintaining keeping jobs in place. And Mr. Briere said that in the last election campaign, the Conservative Party mentioned that it was going to go to great lengths to find ways of keeping jobs in Shawinigan and Jonquière. But one thing that we've forgotten about since the beginning of this discussion is that we're talking about jobs as if they weren't humans, human beings that can become specialized collections agents. You can just pick them up and drop them in another location and retrain them and repurpose them as if they weren't human beings. But this is a crucial issue for these two regions, and that's why our stance favoured finding a way of working on the form so that both agencies could process the form as they do, but more efficiently. Now, according to Mr. Sainte-Marie, the bill will enable the provincial government to collect federal taxes on individuals, corporations and companies on behalf of the Government of Canada. So we're not just talking about a single tax return here, we're talking about collecting taxes, which is a major nuance vis-a-vis this debate. In addition to this, in the bill, there's the whole issue of tax evasion that has absolutely nothing to do with a single tax return for the benefit of Quebecers. So the question is quite straightforward, and I ask this question of PIPS and also the syndicat in Quebec. Now, why is it so difficult for representatives of workers to agree on finding a way to have a single tax return with a view to simplifying Quebecers' lives? That's the question that I'd ask you. Since the beginning of this debate, we're talking about protecting jobs, we're talking about job losses, but ultimately the goal is to have a single tax return. Can we work together to achieve this, Mr. Briere?
Briere, and then Mr. Couillard, and then Mr. Sylvestre, and then Mr. Couillard. Mr. Briere.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Monsieur Berthold, merci.
Mr. Berthold, thank you for the question. I'm glad you asked it. Of course, we want to protect jobs. But I'd like to remind you that Quebec experts have said that the House is a bloody mess, if you'll excuse my expression. And despite Mr. Sainte-Marie's good intentions and the good intentions of this bill, it's going to be very tough and it's going to cost someone a lot of money at some point. Let me just give you a very simple example. I can provide you with this, but there was a report that was commissioned by the Parliamentary Budget Officer in 2018 at the request of two members of the House of Commons on taxing sickness insurance policies and benefits. And in the Tax Act, there is an exemption for these policies when employers pay for them on behalf of their employees. And there are hundreds of thousands of Canadians that take advantage and benefit from this. It's taxable in Quebec. And the study that I can provide you with, which was produced or commissioned by the Parliamentary Budget Officer, said that to have a single tax return, you need to have one single source of income. For example, the T4 and then the slip one on Quebec, this would include the taxable amount. You can't have two sources of income in this respect on the one form. So just for your interest, the Parliamentary Budget Officer estimated that if you vote in favour of this to have a taxable benefit, this would amount to $2.8 billion in additional tax burdens on individuals, and also a lot of money lost that would otherwise be dedicated to old age security, etc. Now, if Quebec wanted to align itself with the federal legislation, it would have to put in place the exemption for this benefit. I don't have the figures at hand, but I'm talking about millions of dollars in revenue that Quebec collects by taxing this, that the other provinces and the federal government wouldn't tax. This is irreconcilable. Either it's going to cost Canadian taxpayers millions of dollars or Quebec taxpayers millions of dollars. And there's a whole lot of other difficulties because of the difference between the two pieces, the two systems.
Mr. Briere, I want to go on to Mr. Sylvestre, and I see 4 hands of witnesses up. So I'll go to Mr. Sylvestre and then come to, we'll have to go to Mr. McLeod.
It's an excellent question, Mr. Berthold. Now, when you said earlier that when it comes to Jonquière and Shawinigan, 2 of our biggest centres in Revenue Quebec are in Shawinigan and Jonquière. So whether there were to be one single tax return under the purview of Quebec, we're talking about the same region and the same. As far as the administration is concerned, when it comes to a duplication of administration, clearly that will cost Canadian taxpayers more. That goes without saying. We know that kind of duplication doesn't make sense, and it would be a saving to have a single tax return. And that has been demonstrated. And Mr. Berthold, if you were to ask me the question and then Mr. Briere the question, to determine whether we want to protect our own respective members, of course we're going to answer you by saying yes. But you need to take a step back, and we're talking about 6,000 federal employees, 12,000 in Quebec. So you have to bear that in mind.
Okay, did Mr. Couillard, Mr. Gaudreau have a quick point?
Oui, c'est pour répondre.
Yes, in response to Mr. Berthold's question, yes, it's highly complicated with these 2 levels of government when it comes to taxpayers. There's a cost that's borne by taxpayers themselves. And Bill C-224 isn't going to solve the problem of the costs and the complexity of tax returns. The 2 pieces of legislation need to be simplified. We'd like this to occur at a political level. And when the 2 levels of government don't agree on the ultimate goal of simplifying the system, well, then we have a problem. And as an auditor, the onus isn't on me to simplify the tax returns, even if I'd like to be able to do so.
Mr. Gaudreau.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. We're talking a lot about single tax returns as if it was just a simple form, but we're talking about a single taxation process. It's not just a form that has to be filled out with the right information. There's all additional requests for information. There's processes of inquiry and investigation. And so there's a whole process that is duplicated currently. So the idea of having a single tax return also means having a single taxation process. And that's what we're talking about here, having one single interlocutor. And that would be one single middleman, if you will, and that would be Revenue Quebec. And that would also respect the principle of proximity, i.e. Quebecers would have this handled in their own backyards. And they would have a one-stop shop. And that's obviously a clear benefit for Quebec and Quebecers. There would be enhanced quality of service to the public by having a single tax return. And the opposite would occur if the status quo were to remain.
Well, we're well over, but a quick answer, Ms. Davio. And then we'll go on to
super
Mr.
quick,
McLeod.
10 seconds. We can't, you're oversimplifying this because the Income Tax Act is like 4 inches thick. That's the Federal Income Tax Act. You just can't put it all on the same form. You need to take a step back and figure out a mechanism to simplify that's more driven by informatics and artificial intelligence and some of the solutions that we have for the future. Let's not look at old solutions to new problems.
Okay, Mr. McLeod, 5 minutes or thereabouts today, it seems.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses. Very interesting discussion, and I think I'm from the Northwest Territories, which is a long ways from Quebec, but I think we can all appreciate that having two tax systems, separate tax systems to collect income tax is more costly. It's the same group of taxpayers. There's issues of administration and compliance, and it would be cheaper to do it under one system. But I think we're talking about two different things. At least that's the understanding I'm getting, and I don't understand why it isn't all part and parcel of the same discussion. But we're talking about collection of taxes, but I don't hear any desire to seem to move towards harmonization of taxes. I don't think the Quebec government's proposal, the proposal that we're talking about, includes any harmonization with the federal law. And so to me, that means there's still going to be two sets of calculations happening, even though they may be sent to the same address. And I would say that's still a duplication in the same form. So my question, first of all, is to whoever wants to answer it, is why isn't harmonization on the table as we discuss solutions to this issue?
We'll start with Mr. Briere, and then I believe Ms. Davio.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. McLeod, I want to really thank you for your question. You got it. You got it. You're talking to experts that are to witnesses that are all involved in unions, and we're giving you our side of job losses and all that. That's okay. We can argue like savings, all that. But what you just said is what the tax experts in Quebec, and I would invite the members of the committee to consult, maybe tax experts or report articles in Le Devoir that I could provide you. The conclusion are exactly what you just said. You cannot have a single income tax return right now in Quebec. It's not feasible. It's not possible right now. It's not realistic because there's two income tax act. That's why there's a problem. And I'm not judging. I'm not saying Quebec has its tax act and Canada has its tax act. And there needs to be harmonization. You cannot get around it. I know that you would like that, Mr. St. Marie, but I'm honest with you. It's not possible. Don't believe me? Check with tax experts, and that's the first answer they'll tell you. You need to harmonize, and that's why I'm saying that the Quebec government will not have a choice than to lose some of its autonomy to match some of its policies, tax policies, with the federal government and the 900 provinces, unless you convince the federal government and the 900 provinces to match some of theirs with the Quebec government. And I think good luck with that. So that's why it's a problem. That's why it's not simple. You cannot do a single income tax return with two tax laws with so many differences. That's as simple as that.
Ms. Davio and Mr. Goodrow.
Yeah, I certainly believe that from a worker's perspective, which is really the only perspective that we can bring, harmonization is a great idea. Their jobs are so much more complicated because of the need to deal in two different tax regimes. It limits the ability to be able to collect taxes as effectively as possible. It makes everybody's job more difficult. So I certainly believe harmonization should be on the table, but it's not. This is a bill that is simply having Quebec take over the administration of federal taxes, which is the reverse of the scenario for all other provinces in Canada. And it's going to have a negative impact on federal jobs. It's going to have potentially a negative impact on those smaller communities where those federal jobs are located. And we don't actually think it's going to simplify anything for anybody, because the problem is at the root is that you have two very different income tax acts, very different and complex, as I said, like 4 inches thick acts, and those will need to be harmonized before you can get to anything like a single form. But there is solutions, I believe, to make taxes simpler for Quebecers, and I am Quebecers. I hope those are looked at, and I don't want to sound like a broken record, but automation is the way to simplify taxes for Canadians.
Mr. Goodrow. Mr. Goodrow?
Oui, merci beaucoup.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, the whole issue of harmonization isn't really included in this bill. It could have been, but of course it would have made this whole operation more complex. Now, as far as political consensus is about Quebec's tax autonomy, clearly, were there to be harmonisation, well, this would simplify Quebecers' lives tax-wise, but of course the federal government would have to cede a lot of tax responsibility to the Quebec government. And if all players acted in good faith, it could be achieved. Of course, it would be highly complex, but in the long term, there would be gains in efficiency, and it would also be a recognition of Quebec's fiscal autonomy.
Okay, then Ken, Mr. McLeod, do you have another quick question?
I have one quick question. I'm listening here trying to understand everything that's going on, and I hear the number of employees, like in the thousands, that are involved and could be affected or would have to transfer over if there was one agreement to go to one system. And there's two unions involved. I'm just curious, is the unions in agreement that one would represent the other in the case that one of the entities one of the governments decided to allow the other one to take over? Is there, or would there be some conflict between the unions and resistance for job loss and transferring from one union to another?
Okay, I'll start with Ms. Davio, go on to Mr. Sylvestre, and end with Mr. Briere. Ms. Davio.
Thank you. There's a whole process that has to be gone through when members need to be recertified. So if there's a devolution to the province or vice versa, the provincial employees join the federal workers, there would be a process undertaken under the Labor Board to determine where each of these members, which union would represent each of these members. It's not a conflict-based process. It's a legal process that we all must follow, and that would be determined by the Labor Board.
Mr. Sylvestre?
Au Québec,
in Quebec, well, we aren't the only representatives. There are 7 representatives when it comes to Revenue Quebec. There are the lawyers, there are several unions that would be affected. But what I can tell you is that on our end, yes, it's a question of protecting members. There's no way of hiding that from you. And Mr. Briere can't do that either. But when it comes to protecting employees at a provincial level, it's a much greater concern when it comes to the Quebec Quebec's Labour Code. There's far greater protections under the Quebec Labour Code vis-a-vis the Canadian Labour Code. And that is quite stark. And I think that that level of protection is important for members. But as far as reaching agreement, Mr. McLeod, between various unions or even 2 unions, it would be difficult because Mr. Briere represents CRA employees across the country, whereas there are the employees of a number of ministries and organisations in the Quebec government. So therefore, it would be difficult to please everyone. But the whole issue is the one of protection under the 2 labour codes, Quebec and Canada.
That's what we find, Mr. Sylvestre, in politics. It's very difficult to please everyone. Mr. Briere.
We have the same problem as union leaders with thousands of members, I can tell you that. Écoutez, pour répondre à...
Well, listen, to respond to the question, and as Ms. Deville pointed out, there's a process in place to determine who represents which employees and in which place. There's a big difference in terms of the reality in the provincial public service and the federal public service when it comes to labour standards and the various labour codes. Let me give you an example. Federal employees have higher wages than provincially. because in federal public servants have the same wage from coast to coast to coast, which is not the case for the province, of course. So that's another issue to be borne in mind. It's difficult to transfer public servants from one place to another. And let me point out that there are employees of Revenue Quebec that have flirted with the idea of joining my union or the Alliance de la Fonction Publique du Canada, the Public Service Alliance, but it didn't work, that there was a legal process that has been put in place. People have looked at what's happening at the CRA. They see there are a number of benefits, but they've decided to remain with their union at Revue Quebec, and that's their choice.
Okay, we are going to have to end it there. We got a hard stop at 6 o'clock, I guess, Ottawa time. Tonight, there was I think Julie had a question raised that where and how many job losses outside of Quebec. Whether you can answer that or not, I'm not sure. But if you could send any information on that to the clerk, that'd be helpful. I think. Michael, usually when we talk to CRA, it isn't an exciting discussion, as a rule. But this was, as Julie and Michael have said, this was a really interesting discussion this afternoon, and I want to thank all of you for outlining your points pretty directly, and so we had a very good discussion. So thank you very much to the witnesses for that. Just to committee members on Bill C-208. We haven't made a lot of decisions on how we want to handle that. We know Mr. Maguire is coming before the committee. So could I suggest for the moment that we try and arrange a 3-hour meeting for witnesses on Mr. Maguire's bill? If we could have 2 panels, an hour and a half each, and 4 witnesses on each of those panels. So we could start with 8 witnesses and that would be a start. It might be enough to complete it. I don't know. But in any event, if members could have their witnesses in as soon as possible from the various parties, that'd be great. So we'll start with 8. We'll try for a 6-hour meeting, a 3-hour meeting. We mightn't be able to get it. We'll see what happens. Okay, with that, no disagreement on that point. All right, folks, meeting adjourned. And again, thank you, the witnesses, for your presentations today and the very interesting discussion. Thank you. Meeting adjourned.
Merci tout le monde. Bonne soirée.
Thank you, Mr.